Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Corsair K55 RGB, an affordable membrane-style gaming keyboard from Corsair that'll set you back around $50, and an interesting keyboard with a number of very nice highlights to it, including dedicated macro keys that you can see on the left-hand side that work with Elgato Stream Deck software, dedicated media control buttons on the right, a full-size design, some RGB lighting, a detachable wrist rest, and a few other niceties as well. Now, before I get started with this unboxing video, it's worth mentioning that there are two versions of the K55 RGB Pro. The K55 RGB Pro standard one that you can see here, and the XT, which is a slightly fancier version that's a bit more expensive and that offers per key RGB illumination. The standard K55 RGB Pro only has RGB over 5 different zones, and I'll be covering that RGB lighting a bit more later on and talking about the differences between them or what that means. And the RGB is one of the letdowns in the way it's zoned, but I'll cover that in a bit more depth later on, as well as talking about how it works within the IQ software. Now, the other highlights to this keyboard is that it also is IP42 rated, so it protects you against spills and other problems, but it's not water resistant or waterproof, so you wouldn't want to spill a beer over it or use it in the bath. So it's worth bearing in mind that it will resist maybe some crumbs and things like that, but it won't hold up to a full soaking, so it's worth keeping that in mind. Now, this is a membrane style keyboard, so it's quieter and softer to touch than a mechanical gaming keyboard, but not as responsive as something with optical mechanical switches, and even something like the K65, which I reviewed recently, which uses Cherry MX switches. And I'm going to do a separate video with just the key switch sounds so you can hear those, and also there'll be a segment later on in this video where I'll let you hear the difference between these keys and those on the K65, just so you can hear the difference, because the difference between membrane and mechanical is quite remarkable. And membrane keyboards are often cheaper and more affordable, and this one continues that trend, but it also is very comfortable to use and quiet. So if you're looking for a quieter gaming keyboard, actually membrane might be the way to go. Now, as I said, this has a detachable wrist rest. This is what Corsair pictures as a soft touched rubber wrist rest, essentially a mix of plastic and rubber. It has a very rough textured surface to it, which isn't uncomfortable on the wrists, and it does give some nice support, but I do think that over time you'll probably find a build-up of dirt in there and you'll need to give it a wash and a clean, which won't be a problem because it is detachable. But I do think that maybe the clips on it are probably a bit flimsy, so you'll need to be careful when removing them. It also has a fairly standard rubber USB cable that isn't detachable, and there's no USB pass-through, so it's not super posh in that way. However, it does have those other things included in it. So there are a number of nice features built into it, like those macro keys, the media control keys, and other things, easy access, and really nice features for such an affordable keyboard. One thing of note is this shiny bar along the top with the Corsair logo and those other buttons, I found is a real dust magnet. Once you peel off that protective layer, I found that almost immediately it was attracting dust and hair and things to it and sucking them in, and it's going to pick up a lot of dirt and dust over time. But out of the box and when clean, that looks really nice. I think it has a kind of a really nice look to it for such a budget keyboard. It doesn't look terribly cheap. It probably feels a bit cheaper than it looks, so I don't think the video is going to do it justice in that way. You know, it's not super solid aluminium framing or anything like that, but it is still a nice keyboard. More importantly, it's comfortable to type on and comfortable to use. It's not obnoxiously loud like some mechanical gaming keyboards are, and so if you're looking for something quiet, then this is well worth considering. And the housing on the switches that I'll show you a bit later on is also raised in a nice way, and the back plate is kind of this white finish on it, which you can't really see until it's plugged in terribly well, but that essentially gives you a decent amount of RGB lighting and bleed around the edges of the keys. And so the overall result of it so far is a very nice keyboard for the amount of money that you're paying. It has some very nice features and specifications, and I'll leave all the specs and everything in the description, as well as a link to the official pages so you can see and find out more and work out where to purchase it. But as you'll see already, a very nice setup for the money that you're getting here. And don't forget, if you want to hear the keystrokes without me talking over them, please check out the links in the description, because I'll have a separate video for that. But one thing I do want to show is the difference between the membrane switches on this and the Cherry MX red switches on the K65 Mini, which you can see on the left hand side. So I'm just going to be quiet so you can listen to the difference between that for a minute. And what you'll notice is there's a lot sharper sound from the mechanical switches on the K65 Mini, and a much more muffled sound from the K55. So that membrane style, if you're not sure of the difference between membrane and mechanical, you'll notice a much more dampened sound from a membrane keyboard. You don't have that tactile feel as much in your fingers, and it's a softer touch overall, and that is actually not a bad thing necessarily. It's easier on the fingers, but for gaming purposes it's not quite as agile and responsive. The actuation isn't as fast, and it's not quite as accurate really. But there's no negative impact in my experience from day-to-day use for typing and for gaming. It's not a terrible keyboard. This is essentially a very good budget keyboard with some really nice features to it. Some of the features that you'll see on more expensive ones as well. Something simple additions like those dedicated media keys I really enjoy. Now, a bit of the RGB lighting that I was talking about earlier on, the standard K55 is split into 5 zones controllable within IQ software, and what I noticed here on the default settings is it feels quite jagged the way it splits between them. So you can see on these lighting modes it's basically putting the different colors between each of the zones, and the way it's done it feels really forced. It's hard to explain it in words, but it feels like they're just clashing and colliding. Not that easy on the eye. I don't feel it's as smooth as it could be. Used to using keyboards that have per key illumination, and the way that those sort of lighting effects flow across the keyboard is much smoother. This feels quite jagged and disjointed, and I think that's just because of the zone setup. So if the RGB lighting is something that you're interested in, you particularly want a sort of color scheme that changes and goes between those different zones, then you might want to consider springing for the XT instead. If you're going to be using a static color, and I admit that I often like to use static colors anyway, then it probably isn't going to be a problem if you have a static color across the whole board. But this isn't per key RGB illumination, so it doesn't have as many customization options for the RGB lighting anyway, so that's another thing to consider. But then you're getting a fairly decent keyboard, so you're going to have some compromises considering the amount of money you're paying. That said, there are some other highlights. You have the G1 to 6 keys on the left hand side, dedicated macro keys. As I said, they'll work with Elgato Stream Deck software, so if you have that installed, you can use those keys for dedicated controls on there, so that's pretty nifty. So if you're a streamer or you want to do other things like have Philips Hue lighting turning on or Elgato's lighting or something like that, you can access those buttons with ease as well. Now the keycaps, you will notice from those close-ups of the G keys, some of the etching isn't perfect, and you find that the RGB doesn't shine through that well. That's something I've usually seen on PBT double shot keycaps, but it's something that is an issue here, and these obviously aren't fancy, super fancy PBT ones. They're just ABS plastic, and so it's a bit of a shame that that's the thing. But again, these are affordable keycaps on an affordable keyboard, and you'll see how the setup works on this as well. I noted earlier on that the housing is raised, and you can see that in a second, and you'll see just how deep the keycaps are and the strut that goes from them into the keyboard itself. And this is how obviously it's protected. The switches are protected from ingress of dirt and dust because of the raised nature of them, and so you could spill stuff underneath and then just blow it out with compressed air, or remove the keycaps and clean through here fairly easily. So maintenance is actually going to be quite easy, and if you're a messy gamer, then you're probably not going to have any issues, and this might actually be a good choice for you in that way. The other highlight is this white backplate, this plastic white goodness here. That helps with the RGB lighting, lets a lot of the light bleed around the edges of the keys and really shine. So although It's not the fanciest RGB lighting that I've seen, which isn't surprising considering the money. It is still quite satisfying and nice looking as well. So there are some highlights and lowlights on it depending on your personal preference, but overall a very nice bit of kit. Here we are within Corsair's IQ software, and from here you can adjust settings for the lighting, the key assignments and other things with ease. And the setup for this is fairly straightforward because this keyboard doesn't have a great deal of controls in terms of lighting, for example. We'll quickly cover off the lighting and we'll start with that. So you can see that you have these 5 zones starting on the left, middle, right, and over here, then on the numpads. So you can basically change the lighting in those specific zones, and you'll see it's as default it's set to this watercolor one, and you can see what I was talking about with it kind of just bashing from one section to the next, and it's not terribly good, I don't feel like. But you can go through a number of different settings, including rainbow wave, color shift, color pulse, color wave, visor, watercolor, and type wave, and some of those are quite fun. So the type wave, for example, is nice because it's when you press a key, it then spreads out across those sections. But as I said, this isn't per key RGB illumination, so you can't change the color of specific keys. You can, however, set a custom color. So for example, we can set a static color of white for the entire section, or you could set it for just a couple of sections. So you could have it white on this side, and you can see that I've still got watercolor set, so it's essentially layering it in a sort of layered way, but only by zone rather than top of each other. So here we have it as set to the first 2 zones of white, and then you have watercolor effect on the rest of the keyboard. And you obviously have some flexibility in how you do that, so you could have different sections as different colors or the whole thing. Hardware lighting allows you to basically set a specific color or lighting effect that will be present when your PC is locked or when IQ isn't running. For example, you can just set it so it's off, so you could set it to a black, for example, or just set it to not have any color at all and be completely bottomless, so it's not lighting up unnecessarily, which is something that's nice to have. Performance settings essentially allows you to do a variety of things where you can disable your Alt Tab, Alt F4, Shift Tab and Win key when in the middle of a gaming session. So you can basically just do this, and then when you press in that Windows lock key at the top here, that will stop from interfering with your game. You can also adjust performance settings for the polling rate, and it'll go up to 1000 Hz with 1 millisecond response time. Now, key assignments are probably the most interesting section for this keyboard. As I said already, you've got the G1 to 6 keys where you can assign specific macros or any other actions. So you, for example, you have keystroke, mouse stroke, keyboard buttons, text, media controls. You can launch apps. You can disable those keys if you don't want to use them, or you can assign a macro. But don't think that that action is limited to just these keys. You can use these keys as a dedicated key for specific actions. As I said, if you have Elgato's Control Center software, you can use the Stream Deck software to launch Elgato actions from here, or you can program macros or whatever else directly on here within the IQ software. But you can also set up macros elsewhere. So for example, if we record a macro in here, I'm just going to write test a few times in here and then click stop. There are a few things to note. You can see, for example, that you can set it so it'll record delays or it won't record delays. You can get it to track a mouse and keyboard clicks and events from the keyboard and the thing. You can also go through and copy and delete and reposition these actions as well, and you'll see there's detail on when the key was pressed and when it was released, and when you've got a delay on it, it'll have a timer on that, so you can do all sorts of things. But what makes it interesting is that you can assign it to a key. So for example, we can set this macro key so that it runs on caps lock. So now when I press the caps lock button, it does the test macro that I just created. And you can basically, so what I'm showing essentially is that although you have dedicated macro keys, you can assign any key you want to do something else, which is obviously a handy function to have. So there are a number of straightforward and easy settings on here that allow you to access what you need to with ease. Another thing that you might have noticed is there's an MR button at the top here. This is for macro recording at a hardware level. So for example, you can record macros anytime on the fly without having to go into IQ. or run it as well. So basically, to record a macro, you press and hold that MR button until the light next to it flashes. And then you can press the keys that you want to record, and then press that M key again, and then you can assign it to one of the G keys. And so you can set it up so you've got macros assigned to specific G keys on the fly without having to do any software editing, which is really nice. But as you'll see, it's much more powerful within the IQ software, so it's a lot easier to do there, but it's nice to have that capability on the fly. So there you go. As you can see, the K55 RGB is an affordable gaming keyboard that's feature rich for this price. So it's a really nice membrane style keyboard with a number of really great features to it, although the RGB lighting is a little bit naff. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Let me know if you've got any comments, and check out the description for other links you might find useful. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Hope you found it useful, interesting, hilarious, or all of the above. Be sure to check out the description for other information you might find interesting, and subscribe and watch these other videos as well that I think might be useful to you, and have a great life.